Hello everybody, hope you're doing well. Just wanted to put out a video touching on a topic that I used to cover a lot more on this channel, and that would be the essence energies distinction. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure the vast majority of you do know, that this is kind of a central point of debate, especially online. In fact, mostly online between Orthodox and Catholics. And the idea essentially centers around whether or not it can be said that in God you can make a distinction between the essence of God and the activities or the operations of God. And a lot of the Orthodox affirm this because Gregory Palamas held it. He taught it in his triads, and it became kind of a central focus of the hesychast movement in the East. And many Orthodox basically see the West's embrace of absolute divine simplicity as a repudiation of the essence energies distinction, because we've of course believed that all the activities of God, insofar as they are activities of God, are to be identified with the divine essence. So I did a lot of videos on this on my channel already, so if you want more of a primer on that, or a more foundational introductory level take on that, you can catch some of those videos. But I wanted to actually address what I think it might bring new light to the discussion. I wanted to contribute something I think somewhat fresh, somewhat new. That would be my recognition, I guess, of St. Thomas's own articulation of this very distinction in his commentary on Dionysius the Areopagite. Now the bulk of what I'm about to say has already been available for my patrons in the form of an article, but every so often I like to take what I expressed in those articles and also use them for videos to be available for everybody. It's not going to be for even the vast majority of the articles, but every so often I think it's a good thing to do. I do a monthly article for Patreon, so if any of you are interested in that, you can become a patron at patreon.com/classicaltheist, and that would be at the $10 level for the monthly articles. You can check the description for additional details on that. So I just want to make this video on the essence energies distinction of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, oftentimes when debating with what I call neo-Palamites, these are supporters of Palamas, typically Orthodox supporters of Palamas. I call them neo-Palamites because I personally think that people like J. Dyer and others adopt an articulation of the essence energies distinction that's not necessarily found natively in Palamas. It's really their formulation of it, I think, tends to be as a result of more recent theological development pertaining to Palamas. But oftentimes when debating with them on the essence energies distinction, it's easy to come away with these discussions with the impression that it's essentially an axiomatic presupposition that the point of contention is the essence energies distinction as such, so that the Thomistic or the Latin side of the debate is essentially arguing against the distinction, whereas the Palamite side is arguing in favor of the distinction. However, as I've argued many times before, I think this is far too simplistic of a framework within which to talk about the issue. Ultimately, I think the best way to go about having a successful and effective dialogue with well-educated Palamite would be to appeal to the common ground upon which both Palamas and Thomas stood. And that would be personified in the figure of Dionysius the Areopagite, or as we call him now, Pseudo-Dionysius, depending on what your historical research tells you about the authenticity of the author. In fact, I would consider Palamas's triads as, in some respects, a commentary on the Dionysian corpus itself. And on the Thomistic side, Dionysius happens to be one of Thomas's most quoted patristic sources, especially when it comes to his doctrine of God and his treatment of divine simplicity. If I were to pinpoint any key doctrine of Dionysius's that relate most heavily to the Palamite distinction, it would have to be where in the divine names he articulates a distinction between what he calls the divine discretions and the divine union. This distinction will become very important. Divine union, per the Suda Dionysius, refers to God as he is in himself, entirely antecedent to his decision to manifest himself to creatures. And it's with this respect to God considered in his interior divine union that Suda Dionysius uses terms like super essential or beyond being or nameless, etc., right? Very apophatic terms. St. Thomas, in his own work, recognizes the super essentiality of the divine essence, of course, by acknowledging the metaphysical impossibility of any created intellect to comprehend the divine essence. He talks about this in his commentary, but he also talks about it heavily in the Summa as well. And this would be to know God as he is known by himself and within himself. It would be to know him from within the inner chamber of his inner union. The divine discretions, on the other hand, refer to God insofar as he is known through his outward processions or manifestations. It is through these divine discretions, or we could maybe refer to as manifestations or processions, that we can speak of God through a plurality of names as divine operations turned toward us, received by creation according to its finite capacity to receive this divine presence. And this, it seems to me, is what Palamas sought to articulate through his ousia, energeia, essence and energies distinction. And on the Dionysian scheme, however, the divine discretions are, from the standpoint of God himself, nevertheless identical to the divine unions themselves, as Dionysius himself says, quote, "All the divine names are to be taken as applying in common in the same manner, simply, indivisibly, and unitedly to the whole Godhead," unquote. So this gets at what I really see to be an identification, an ontological identification of the divine operations, the divine discretions, and the divine union, the divine essence, that they are to be identified with each other, which is not to say synonymous, but identified. They are considered multiple from the standpoint of the termini of these outward divine processions. In fact, Palamas himself implicitly concedes as much when he says, quote, "The divine and deifying illumination and grace is not the essence of God, for it comes forth from God, and the essence does not come forth from itself. This illumination and grace is not the Holy Spirit, but the energy of the Holy Spirit, and it is the grace and energy of the Son. It proceeds from the Father through the Son, and is in the Holy Spirit. It is one and multiple, one in nature, multiple in manifestations that derive from it," unquote. Now pay close attention to what he's saying here. When he says that the divine and deifying illumination and grace, or the divine energies, are not the divine essence, he's essentially saying that these are not to be conflated with the Dionysian divine union, but rather the divine discretions. And this does not mean, though, that the divine discretions from the standpoint of God himself are not substantially identical with the divine union, but that they can be distinguished from the divine union precisely considered as manifestations. This means that what grounds the distinction is the ratio by which we consider these divine energies as manifestations or outward processions of the one and simple divine energy toward us, which is why he's quick to admit that the divine energy is one, considered as it is in itself, and multiple insofar as it proceeds outward to meet its termini, which is creation. Therefore, on this schema, while it may be argued that the Thomistic account might be excluded, if you're a Scotist or something like that, it's nevertheless an account perfectly harmonious with scholastic thought. Okay, but we can't stop here. The attentive listener is going to acknowledge that video, which is rooted in the article, is titled "The Essence Energies Distinction of St. Thomas Aquinas." It's not titled "The Essence Energies Distinction of Dionysius and Palamas," right? And that is because I think it can actually be argued that St. Thomas himself articulates some variation of this essence energies distinction in his own commentary on the divine names of Dionysius the Areopagite. And it sounds remarkably similar to how Palamas himself articulates this concept. As I said earlier, it's important to link St. Thomas and Palamas through their common denominator of Dionysius. So I'm going to read St. Thomas's commentary, which I think is very revealing. So he says, quote, "Therefore, to consider the first principle according as it is in itself, this is to consider its union, and this existence of the first principle in itself he calls supergathering." By he's referring to Dionysius. And he names this supergathering both hidden and inaggressible. Hidden indeed because God can be known by us inasmuch as we know the participations of his goodness, yet according as he is in himself, he is hidden to us. Yet he says inaggressible because according as it is in itself, the first principle is communicated to none, and thus it is through it, and thus it is as through it, it does not go out from itself. And on account of this, the divinity itself so considered through excellence, distinguishing it from all things, he calls singularity, because the singular is that which is incommunicable. Then, when he says, yet discretions befitting the good, he expounds through its opposite, the common mode of distinctions. And he says that the aforementioned teachers call discretions processions and manifestations of the deity, which befit it inasmuch as it is the good itself, because it is of the ratio of the good that from it there should proceed effects through its communication. And it must be considered that against what he has said above, hidden and inaggressible, he posited fittingly enough processions and manifestations, because it is manifested through effects going forth from it, and in a certain mode the deity itself proceeds into its effects, while it hands on a likeness of itself to things according to the proportion of each, such that nevertheless its excellence and singularity remain for itself uncommunicated to things and hidden to them. Therefore these processions are called discretions, because unless other things were to flow out from a first principle, the first principle would not have anything by which it would be discerned." Unquote. So notice what St. Thomas says here. He says the divine unions, or God as he is in himself, the essence, in the Dionysian sense, is hidden, inaggressible, and even incommunicable. This is to safeguard, of course, the unknowability of God as he is in himself from the standpoint of circumscribing and comprehensively attaining knowledge on part of the created intellect. On this point, he's in perfect harmony with the Cappadocian jealous guard of divine ineffability. And yet when he touches on the divine discretions or energies, that's the distinction here. Union corresponds to essence, discretion corresponds to energies. He speaks as though he is making a distinction in similar terms used by Dionysius and Palamas. While the precise distinction he's employing would, of course, most comfortably align with the scholastic minor virtual distinction with the foundation in reality, he is nevertheless articulating this distinction in a way that is not formally contradicted by either Palamas or Dionysius. I hope you can see that. This is, I would say, St. Thomas's essence energies distinction, and I would argue that St. Thomas's more refined metaphysical language simply provides a greater depth and precision that can be put to fruitful use in understanding Dionysius and even Cappadocian apathetic theology. So in recognizing the way in which St. Thomas comments on Dionysius's words, I think you can see that if you were taking that commentary by itself, you'd be hard-pressed to find a way in which he even parts ways from Palamas in articulating this essence energies distinction. And I think that difficulty, underlying that difficulty, I think you actually find the deeper harmony. Because if St. Thomas can articulate it in those terms that I would say are very palatable to a Palamite, I think you can see that his further discussion of divine simplicity may also be compatible. And so I hope this was helpful. I hope these were helpful reflections. Let me know what you think in the comments. Hit the like button if you like this video. And if you want to support my channel, support the content that I make, patreon.com/classicaltheist is a great way to do that. $5 for unlimited Q&A access to the messaging system per month subscribed. And also you get monthly book recommendations. You get over 100 pages of catechetical notes. The $10 would be all of that plus monthly articles, and you can request a video on a topic of your choice, so long as it pertains to, philosophy, theology, that kind of thing. God bless you.